Hello everyone, my name is Gary O'Mealy, and in this video we are going to talk about the hypothalamus and the pituitary. So in a previous lecture we talked about what we call the simple endocrine reflex. So this looks a lot like one of our typical negative feedback homeostasis loops that we've talked about before. So the idea here is that a stimulus is detected by an endocrine gland, which is acting as both the sensor and the control center in this case. And then the way that gland responds as the control center is it secretes a hormone into the bloodstream. That hormone circulates throughout the body, finds its target cells, these effector cells, which, again, what makes them effector cells is that they have the right receptor for this particular hormone here. And then whatever that hormone does, acting on that receptor on those target cells, will produce the response that will make the stimulus go away and trigger the whole shutting off of this process by negative feedback. So the best way to think about a simple endocrine reflex is one hormone secreted by one gland. So it sounds very simple. That's why simple is literally in the name of the reflex. But here is the issue. We are going to see simple endocrine reflexes and we are going to study them. But the issue is that a lot of endocrine responses are actually much more complicated than that. So many hormones that we're going to look at are only secreted by a particular gland when the combination of the hypothalamus and pituitary say it's okay, essentially, okay? So what that means is that, say, cortisol being secreted from the adrenal cortex, thyroid hormone being secreted from the thyroid, testosterone being secreted from the testes, these things only happen, these hormones only get secreted when they are receiving the proper signals from up above. And by up above, I mean the hypothalamus and pituitary. So anatomically, the hypothalamus and pituitary are both located in the diencephalon of the brain. So you can see a sagittal section here in which you can see the hypothalamus, which literally means underneath the thalamus, so that makes sense. And then the pituitary is kind of hanging down from the hypothalamus, very small structure, and you can see it consists of both an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe. So what we're going to see, essentially, is that the big boss in most homeostasis loops is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is a part of the nervous system. Let's not make any bones about that. So the hypothalamus is a part of the nervous system. It consists of lots of neurons. But what makes these neurons special is that these neurons have endocrine activity. Now, they look like typical neurons. They have a very long axon, but instead of secreting neurotransmitter, they secrete hormones. We call these neurohormones. So what we're going to see when we talk about how the hypothalamus communicates with both lobes of the pituitary, so that's how it's always going to be. The hypothalamus sends a message to one of the lobes of the pituitary, and then that lobe of the pituitary will secrete some hormone that'll go elsewhere. We can see that the cells of the hypothalamus have ways of delivering messages to both lobes of the pituitary. Now, you can only really see in this picture these hypothalamic hormones secreting hormone, or these hypothalamic neurons secreting hormone into what we call the portal system here. We'll talk about that here in a minute. And then this little limited expanse of blood vessels will carry that hormone down to the cells of the anterior pituitary down here. So the hypothalamus does have a way of communicating with the posterior pituitary too, but we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so let's do a quick little overview here of what the most important takeaways are. So the hypothalamus consists of big bundles or collections of neurons in the hypothalamus. These are hormone-secreting neurons, and these bundles or collections of these neurons are called nuclei. Each nucleus is responsible for synthesizing and secreting a different hormone. We're going to find that the hypothalamus actually makes a lot of different hormones. And as such, that's going to make it kind of the big boss here. It can send a lot of different hormonal signals depending on what the situation calls for. So like I said, each nucleus produces a different hormone, and these hormones will be used to communicate with the two lobes of the pituitary. So all of these hypothalamic hormones are there in order to tell each lobe of the pituitary what to do. So the hypothalamus tells each lobe of the pituitary what it needs to do next. Okay, so you can see here anatomically we have what is called the infundibulum. This is just a stalk of connective tissue that hangs down from the hypothalamus and connects us to both the anterior and posterior pituitary. So this infundibulum is very important because it is basically the road, the thoroughfare, the avenue through which the hypothalamus is going to send its hormones to each lobe of the pituitary. So let's quickly talk about how the hypothalamus is going to communicate with each lobe. Now, the picture that I'm painting for you right here is not quite as good as what we looked at before, but just bear with me here. So what we're going to see is that the hypothalamus, the way it communicates with the anterior pituitary, is going to be totally different than how it communicates with the posterior pituitary. So there is a blood vessel system that I referenced before called the hypophyseal portal system, and it connects the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary through the infundibulum. So the way I'm illustrating it here is just a single blood vessel. That is clearly not accurate if we go back and look at this picture here. So the portal system is actually a kind of specialized network of capillaries that directly makes a connection between one place in the body and the next. Portal systems are very useful when you need to send a hormone over a relatively short distance and you can't afford to waste time on that hormone circulating all throughout the body before it eventually comes back and makes its way to its target. So the idea here is that these cells up here in this nucleus of the hypothalamus want to communicate directly with these cells down here in the anterior pituitary. So all they have to do is secrete these hormones into this portal system, and that portal system will carry the hormones directly to where they need to go down here. So that should happen not only very quickly, but that will also ensure that we don't have to secrete a lot of the hypothalamus's hormone in order for this to be effective. Okay, so hypothalamic hormones are carried through to the anterior pituitary cells through this portal system. So the way in which the hypothalamus communicates with the anterior pituitary is secreting a hormone into the blood, and that blood carries it to the cells in the anterior pituitary. So that sounds probably pretty typical based on what we've talked about so far. It's a little different when we're talking about the hypothalamus communicating with the posterior pituitary. We do not have a portal system or any sort of blood vessels connecting the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary. So in order for this communication to occur, the neurons in the hypothalamus that are part of nuclei that deal with the posterior pituitary, they actually extend their axons all the way through the infundibulum, and then they secrete their neurohormones into a blood supply that is at the base of the posterior pituitary. So the implication here is that the posterior pituitary is not actually making its own hormones. It is just receiving hormones that were made up here in the hypothalamus, and then the posterior pituitary is basically just like a port to export those hormones into the bloodstream, from which we can get them delivered to wherever they need to go. So we will cover that in more detail. We will have separate videos on both the posterior pituitary and the anterior pituitary coming up in our next set of videos. So here is kind of a more complete picture of what I was trying to say. So you can see on the anterior side, you have hypothalamic neurons secreting their hormones into the hypophyseal portal system, and that system of capillaries will deliver the hormone directly to the cells of the anterior pituitary, and those cells will respond by secreting a hormone of their own, and that anterior pituitary hormone will be then carried downstream to wherever it is going to go. And we will talk about that in a future video. For the posterior pituitary, we have two specific nuclei here called the supraoptic nucleus and the paraventricular nucleus, which synthesize these two hormones here, And then once those hormones are made, those hormones are transported down through the inside of the axon, so they're still inside the neuron at this point. And then when we get the right trigger, when the stimulus presents itself that we need these hormones, then those hormones will be secreted into this capillary system to be delivered from the posterior pituitary to parts, I don't want to say unknown, but kind of the distant reaches of the body, wherever those hormones are meant to go. So clearly you can see here that the way in which the hypothalamus communicates with each lobe of the pituitary is different. So make sure that you understand that distinction. So let's go through some take-home messages before we wrap up this video. Number one, the hypothalamus produces its own hormones, and it produces several different hormones, and then sends them to the cells of the anterior pituitary through a connecting system of blood vessels. And then the hypothalamus produces hormones, and prior to secretion, sends them down axons to the posterior pituitary where these hormones are stored until we get the right trigger, and then they are secreted into the bloodstream. So, important thing to recognize here, the cells of the posterior pituitary are not making these hormones. They only store them up once they receive them from the hypothalamus. Okay, and then this slide right here is not anything you need to fret about right this second. This is a slide you're probably going to want to come back to in the future once you have watched our next few videos on the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary, once we cover all the different hormones that are involved. But this should hopefully be a nice little study guide in order to help you keep track of which hormones come from where, what parts of the body, what tissues are targets for these hormones, and how are these hormones regulated and how are they made. So you can see here that we have the hypothalamus up here, and you can kind of see how I've tried to illustrate the distinction in terms of how these hormones are delivered to either the anterior pituitary here or the posterior pituitary here. And then you can see kind of the downstream hormones here. And something to go ahead and get you prepared for when we talk about the anterior pituitary, you'll notice that the hypothalamus secretes 4 or more different types of hormones that affect the anterior pituitary. And you can see which hormone gets secreted is by and large going to dictate which hormone the anterior pituitary responds with. So for example, CRH, which stands for corticotropin releasing hormone, when it is secreted by the hypothalamus, it stimulates the anterior pituitary to make this hormone right here, ACTH. Not this hormone, not growth hormone, not these hormones, not this hormone here. It is usually a 1-to-1 proposition. The hypothalamus secretes this hormone, that causes the anterior pituitary to secrete this hormone over here. So we'll cover that in greater detail here in the next video or two, but just go ahead and kind of keep this slide bookmarked for now. I think you will find it useful in the future. Okay, here is a list of vocabulary terms you probably ought to be aware of. And then for checking your understanding, number 1, where are the hypothalamus and pituitary located? Pretty important to understand. And number 2, how is communication between the hypothalamus and the 2 different lobes distinct from one another? So it's really, really important that you have a good understanding of how and why it has to be different when the hypothalamus sends a message to the anterior side versus when it sends a message through the posterior side. Okay, that's going to do it for this video. If you have any questions, go ahead and drop them in the comments section, and I will see you next time. So long.